Hello, welcome to my science fiction and paranormal channel. I'm Nate, and I want to talk to you about Star Wars. Not just any Star Wars, but the very first Star Wars, before any other Star Wars came out in theaters. When I was a kid, I was able to watch Star Wars when the excitement level was beyond believability. It was before The Empire Strikes Back came out, and before everything else that followed. So just make sure that you like, comment, and subscribe to this channel. Are you ready? Let's start to discuss. Before I start, I do want to admit that I didn't actually see Star Wars in the first year that it came out. I was a little too young for that. A few years later, before Empire Strikes Back came out, I went to the theater with my family, and that's when I saw it. There was still enough excitement at that time for Star Wars that there really wasn't that much difference between watching it then and watching it when it first came out. Now, when it first came out, the anticipation was wild. I was a little bit too young to understand the excitement, but it was definitely there. You saw the advertisements, you saw people talking about it all the time. My family was excited about it. I came from a smaller town, so you didn't have all these lines of people waiting to watch the movie, but you definitely had people talking about it and mentioning it. So it was definitely a show that the anticipation was beyond most anything you can think of today, other than perhaps the Harry Potter movies with the younger crowd when the Harry Potter, the first movie, came out. You have to understand that the state of science fiction at that point in the movies was not that great. There really wasn't very good special effects. You could tell that the special effects they used had green screens. You could tell that the models were very unrealistic, maybe even badly lit, and you didn't have that chance to get into those movies and feel like you were in this universe because of all those flaws. And there were many flaws involved with the movies. There was one movie that did really well with science fiction and feeling you were really there, and that was Stanley Kubrick's 2001. It's the only movie before and up until Star Wars that had any realistic science fiction special effects. You couldn't really tell that they were models, except for once or twice. Then Star Wars came out, having been at least 10 years since 2001 came out. I'm sure there's enough people who saw 2001 who went to Star Wars to remember how well done 2001 was. But most people who went did not expect how good the special effects were, how realistic they were. Even if, comparative to 2001, the story was a science fiction fantasy. But that only added to the interest of the movie. That only made people want to watch it more because of how enjoyable it was. Some people say that 2001 was a slow, boring movie, and in fact, when you think about it, it really was for those who weren't invested in what they were seeing. But with this action-adventure science fiction movie that Star Wars was, everybody loved it. Only very few critics at all didn't like it, and most of those weren't really fans of science fiction to begin with. One thing that was unusual for the time was the scrolling words that started the Star Wars movie. Of course, George Lucas did that for a purpose because that's what he remembered from all his childhood movies. Of course, you had Flash Gordon, you had Buck Rogers, you had Cops and Robbers, you had Westerns, all of these things. In fact, Raiders of the Lost Ark later on would try to reenact some of that old spirit along with Star Wars. Both Lucas and Spielberg kind of working jointly together to create this old yet new movie-going experience. And of course, we all know they succeeded. When Star Wars came on the screen and you got past the scroll, there was this panning down from stars to see this ship. It was a small ship. It didn't last for very long in our view, but everything looked real. Everything looked perfect. You were right there in space watching this ship go by, and you couldn't really tell it was a model. All the lighting and the details and everything on that small ship immediately dragged you into the movie. Nothing before it had been experienced, really, except for mentioning 2001. From 2001 up till Star Wars, you did not experience this. You did not actually feel like you were watching something that happened in space. But the amazing thing is the next ship that went by. It was much more detailed, and yet it was bigger and longer, and you couldn't believe that you were seeing this on screen. It was amazing. And so it flew by, and it just kept on going until you saw the back of it, and then it switches to where you now see its front. And it's the epic size that was so amazing. Now, these days, you have epic size of spaceships and big giant battles and whatnot. But Star Wars started it. Star Wars is what really caught the imagination of filmmakers. Now, there's a few movies that tried to capture that Star Wars excitement and feel. Anyone can probably think of some 80s knockoff movies, but they didn't have the budget, and they definitely didn't have the expertise of the science fiction special effects to make it realistic. They were still stuck a decade behind. Star Wars changed everything. And when you saw Star Wars for the first time, you knew everything was changed. In fact, Siskel and Ebert, when they reviewed science fiction movies, would always say, that special effect, it's not anywhere near what Star Wars is. Star Wars became the benchmark of science fiction movies. Some might even say if it wasn't for Star Wars, then Alien and Aliens and Blade Runner wouldn't have ever happened. My favorite scene as a kid when I first saw it and came out of that theater was the very first scene with the hallway battle. You had these two groups shooting at each other, and it just seemed this epic battle in this small space. And yet you felt like, again, you were in the middle of that battle, because all those lasers were going by not only the soldiers, but they were going by the camera. And so you became somewhat of a soldier yourself. So when I came home, I hid behind furniture, I hid behind a refrigerator, I hid wherever there was room for me to go behind and pretended like I was shooting. And it was just a fun reimagining of what I just got home watching. Of course, there's much more than just that scene that I loved, but that seemed like the best action for someone to reenact who didn't really have some spaceship that they could fly in. Who could forget the entrance of Darth Vader? You have to picture it. Here are these white-clad soldiers fighting these gray-clad soldiers, and then some of the fighting ends, and you have this mist of smoke from all the fighting, and then this tall black figure strolls carefully in as if he doesn't have a care in the world, partially covered by all of this smoke. Of course, there was this amazing music that also played when he entered, and it was a very frightening picture, especially for younger kids. And then, when he spoke in that deep voice of James Earl Jones, there's that command factor. This was not someone to mess with. You knew right away watching it. You didn't really need to know who this Darth Vader was. It was very clear he was a bad guy. And when he grabbed hold of that soldier's neck, trying to get that information from him, and then threw him aside as if nothing mattered. It was cinematic history. And we knew it from first watching it. I do have to tell you about a funny story involving the stormtroopers. Remember, I was a little kid when I was watching this first, so I didn't fully understand everything that was going on. But I thought that the stormtroopers were robots. I mean, you couldn't see their faces, you couldn't see any part of their body. You have to remember, this was the first Star Wars that ever was made. So I didn't have anything to compare it to with other Star Wars movies or history. So to me, it looked like the stormtroopers were robots. Now, why that's important and funny is because later on in the movie, when Luke Skywalker and Han Solo are in the stormtrooper outfits, I was wondering the whole time, how did they get into those outfits? Did they dig out all of the robots' mechanisms and then just put it on? Of course, now I look back at that and that was really silly. But again, I was young, never seen these movies before, so there was still some confusing elements involved with Star Wars. It wasn't a perfect movie, but it was darn near perfect for someone who really loves science fiction, especially considering all the other science fiction movies we had to watch, which were not even nearly as good in story or especially special effects. And Luke Skywalker, for us, was a hero. When people complain about the new movies and what they did with Luke Skywalker, you have to understand, Luke Skywalker was a representation of an everyday boy who mostly the girls did grab onto Princess Leia and her strength and her own authoritative command. But for Luke Skywalker, all the teenage boys or younger wanted to go on adventures. They wanted to break free of the lives that they were living at that moment and become something greater. Who really doesn't want to become something greater than they are? That is a simple, basic goal. So when you look at someone and see them as a hero, you want to see them succeed as a hero. Even when they fail, you want them to get back up and become that hero. Because, in a sense, they are part of you. They are something that you can recognize as your own hopes and your own dreams. Now, for those younger viewers of the Star Wars at the time, you couldn't understand why the aunt and uncle wouldn't allow Luke Skywalker to just go out, join whatever fighting force he wanted to against the Empire, and become this great pilot. And later on, when he learns that he is the son of a great Jedi, a great soldier, and we didn't know what a Jedi was, that's something new, but we understood that Jedi was something very important and some kind of great hero. We wanted Luke Skywalker to become that Jedi from the very beginning. His father was a Jedi. There's no reason he shouldn't be a Jedi. It was as if it was saying to the younger audience, at least, yeah, we can go out there too. We can become something as well. Take all that for what it's worth for what's going on now in any of the other Star Wars discussions. And speaking of the Jedi, the Force was brand new. You didn't have these amazing powers where you could fight anybody without knowledge of how things worked. It was a slow progression. You understood at that time that the Force was this power that you could take hold of and do your will on the weak-minded or move objects with your mind. You understood the Force as being exactly what the movie says, surrounding you and inside of you and part of you. It was not this midichlorian, scientific-based power, but it was more of a spiritual power, a power of the mind, a power of the heart. And the idea was powerful enough that you would go out as a kid and you would try to move objects. You would try to get someone to do what you ask them to do with just your thoughts or wave of your hand. You didn't think of the Force as something that would destroy whole forces with lightning speed and lift whole mountains or anything like that. It was just a philosophical idea manifested in a very fantastical story that might not be completely realistic, but it was definitely a philosophy of the will. Now again, Star Wars was not perfect. There were definitely some problems with it. I'm sure if you went to other videos, you could find people breaking down all the problems with the original Star Wars, the first movie. But I do want to say that it was still a good enough movie, both the story and the special effects, that when the special effects weren't perfect, you could still be in the moment. As an example, when the Millennium Falcon first raced out towards space to get away from the Empire, right before they see the Death Star, they're fighting those TIE fighters. And the TIE fighters have this strange little square that's the colors just off. And you have this space, and then you have this square, and then you have the TIE fighter. For someone who really liked what they were watching and was really into the special effects, in your mind, you just considered that to be some kind of force field. Sure, when they shot at it, it wasn't a very good force field. Perhaps it was a force field that kept space out, or I should say kept all the atmospherics in, the air and the pressure and all that inside. At any rate, whatever the purpose, you imagine that that wasn't a bad special effect. It was just a necessity for that spaceship. It wasn't later until you realized that that was a mistake of some kind, or at least something that was not easily fixed with the special effects at that time, no matter how good it was. We all know that George Lucas went back and corrected it and added CGI, and for better or for worse, we don't have the original Star Wars as was seen in theaters. But there was one thing that made Star Wars better than any other movie at that time, and frankly, since that time, and that is the Star Wars action figures. It was almost as exciting as the movie itself, because you could use your own imagination to expand that universe. You could guess what the next Star Wars adventure was going to be like. Years later, of course, those toys are worth a lot of money. But you didn't think about that at that time. You ripped open that case and you played with those toys. Or you just bought old toys because you couldn't buy the new ones, but at least you had toys. So those toys were actually an extension of our love of Star Wars. Star Wars was amazing to watch the very first time because it was something new and exciting, never having been done before with that good of special effects. You had the toy line that you could play with and use your imagination to interact with the Star Wars stories. You didn't know what was coming. You had no idea what the future would hold. All you knew is Star Wars was great, and a new Star Wars had to be great because the first one was so good. I don't think there'll ever be that excitement as what it was like to see Star Wars. And I don't think that any amount of going back to practical work is going to help reignite that excitement either. Spectacle seems to be the name of the Hollywood game. And because you have so much spectacle, you can no longer have special. Star Wars was unique, and it changed how we viewed movies. And it will continue to inform us of what a movie was and what a movie can be. Comment what your experience of Star Wars was, and click on that subscribe button so that you don't miss any future installments. Thank you, and have a great day.